How far could an airline CEO go in order to get back at his old airline? Or more specifically, could United Airlines merge with or even take over American Airlines in order to create a single, supersized American flag carrier? Not too long ago, an idea like that would have been considered, well, insane, and many still see it that way today. But does that mean that it can't happen? With everything else that's going on in world politics today, would such a merger still be outrageous? Well, to understand the background on this and how tense things really are between United and American Airlines, it's worth taking a look at the story that has been brewing in Chicago's O'Hare International Airport for several months now. You see, many big, busy airports in the United States and elsewhere have limits on what's known as slot pairs. A slot is an airport movement, either a takeoff or a landing, so a slot pair is one landing and one takeoff, basically a flight in and out. Airports with really high demand allocate these slot pairs very carefully, and depending on things like the time of day, the amount of time that a plane will spend on the ground, and the size and type of gate needed, these slots can then become really valuable. So that means that if airlines doesn't use these slots, or a good percentage of them at least, well then they stand to lose them. Because obviously airports don't want to lose the revenue that they would get from flights that aren't happening. Now, Chicago O'Hare is a little bit different because it doesn't have slot pair limits set by the FAA like other US airports do. Instead, the city of Chicago is allocating specific gates to individual airlines, and then those airlines need to schedule enough flights for each one of those gates in order to be allowed to keep using them. With that, you might ask, isn't that basically doing the same thing as slot allocations do, except with some different paperwork? Well, no, because there is one really big difference. With this system, there are no upper limits in the scheduling of flights. Instead, the city of Chicago only sets minimum limits on the gate usage, at least at the moment. Now, I know I am oversimplifying these rules a little bit, but the point is that this unusual agreement has set the stage for a really tense fight between American and United. United are actually based in Chicago, with plans to reach 750 departures per day from O'Hare during this year's busy summer season. And if they do, well then that would be a record for the airport. By comparison, in 2025, United averaged 521 daily departures, although that's for the whole year, not just the summer months. Meanwhile, American Airlines have been trying to reassert themselves at O'Hare because they never managed to restore their operations there after scaling back massively during the pandemic years. So their goal is to reach 500 daily departures from O'Hare in the summer months, which creates a problem. Obviously, even if there are no limits officially, the airport's layout and other conditions still means that it isn't really possible for both of these airlines to hit those daily targets, and of course, American and United aren't alone in operating at O'Hare. So the FAA has now decided to step in. Until now, the way things stood, O'Hare would average 3,080 daily flights in the summer of 2026, instead of the 2,680 daily flights that they averaged in 2025. Now, O'Hare might be a monster airport, but adding 400 flights every single day without any major changes in infrastructure is a big ask, to put it mildly. So, in April of 2026, the FAA therefore set a cap of 2,708 daily flights, since American and United weren't able to agree on some kind of limits on their own. And that's where the finger pointing began. Even before the FAA stepped in, American was saying that United's scheduling is reckless and welcomed the intervention from the FAA. And in response, United states that actually American already expanded their Chicago operations massively in 2025, which has cost United $100 million in lost revenue. Now, it should also be said that American disputes those numbers, but even so, United maintains that Chicago is their home base, as well as their biggest hub in the country, and that their planned 750 daily departures in the summer are way less than the 950 daily departures that American have at their own home base in Dallas, Texas. Not to mention that American also performs 650 daily summer departures at Charlotte in North Carolina. Similarly, Delta also plans around 950 daily departures in the summer from their home base at Atlanta. United, American and Delta are the big three airlines in the United States, so United is bullish that they shouldn't have to give ground to the other two at their Chicago home. Now there is more to this story. United generally have a less top-down network, which is why they don't rely as much on their main hub as the others do. But the point is that this is just the latest spat between American Airlines and United. And to understand why that is, we need to take a closer look at United's CEO, Scott Kirby. Kirby is a Texan who grew up not far from Dallas, the home of American Airlines, which is just as well because his connection with AA goes all the way back to 1995 when he started working with American West Airlines. That airline was then absorbed by US Airways in 2005 and Kirby oversaw much of that process, after which he became the US Airways president in 2006. Now 9/11 meant that the 2000s became a difficult time for the airline industry in the United States, with many mergers and consolidations as a result. And US Airways themselves merged with American Airlines after lengthy negotiations in 2013. Now Kirby apparently expected to become American's CEO after that merger, but in the end he didn't. Instead, he became American's president, which might not sound so bad, except for the fact that the person who became American CEO, Doug Parker, also came from US Airways and America West, and he had been less senior than Kirby at those airlines. So maybe you see where this is going. Kirby then jumped ship in 2016 to become president of United Airlines and then become the airline CEO in 2020. And ever since that move, he has often criticized American Airlines, suggesting, for example, that they aren't a premium carrier like United and Delta. Now, the question of who is and isn't a premium airline and what this really means is another discussion, but we'll come back to that. In any case, in mid-April of 2026 came this video's main story. In a meeting with the US president, Scott Kirby suggested that his airline could join forces with American Airlines, and with that, aviation analysts around the world started checking their calendars to make sure that it wasn't April the 1st. Because surely this must be a joke. According to Bloomberg, who were the first to break this story, that meeting actually took place weeks ago, on the 25th of February, when Kirby was in Washington during talks on plans to revamp the Washington Dulles Airport. And I will explain how and why this crazy story came to be in a second, but first, if you're watching this, chances are that you've spent a fair amount of time in airports over the years, and if you have, you'll be very familiar with the public Wi-Fi networks you'll normally find there. Now, some are decent and others not so much, but they all come with one common issue. You don't really know who is running them or who else is on them. And in those type of environments, bad actors can try to intercept or interfere with your connection, especially on unsecured or fake networks. So, if you're doing something sensitive like logging into your bank, that's probably not a risk worth taking. And that's exactly why, whenever I travel, I use today's sponsor, NordVPN. With a single click, Nord encrypts your internet traffic between your device and their secure servers, making it much harder for anyone on the same network to monitor what you're doing. So even on public Wi-Fi, you've got an extra layer of protection. But the feature that I personally like the most is their Threat Protection Pro, which checks websites against known threats before they even load, blocking phishing attempts, fake online stores and malware before they can do any real damage. And that works even when you're not connected to the VPN. In September of 2025, they blocked over 50 million phishing attempts on just 1 month. So if you want to try Nord out for yourself, scan this QR code or go to nordvpn.com/mentor now. That'll give you 4 extra months for free when you sign up for their 2-year plan. And remember, with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, you can try it out completely risk-free. Thank you so much, Nord, for continuing to believe in us and supporting. Now let's get back to the story. Now, those of you who have been keeping an eye on the aviation industry might remember JetBlue's failed attempt to buy Spirit Airlines back in 2022. Spirit originally wanted to merge with Frontier, but JetBlue then basically elbowed Frontier out of the way with a better offer. But that better offer also came with more risk, since JetBlue is bigger than Frontier is, and the US Justice Department therefore intervened, arguing that such a merger would reduce competition. Now, at the time, some analysts argued that even a deal between Frontier and Spirit wouldn't go through, despite Frontier being smaller than JetBlue, because of the overlap between Frontier and Spirit's networks. But either way, since these failed merger attempts, Spirit has been in limbo, entering Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection twice in 2024 and 2025, and they are actually on the verge of another bankruptcy, or even worse, right now as we record this.
This morning at 3 a.m., Spirit Airlines ceased operations.
Like I said earlier, the difficult years after 9/11 had brought a lot of consolidation for the US airline industry. But the last merger of that era was Alaska Airlines' acquisition of Virgin America back in 2016. Since then, US administrations became much more skeptical towards that type of consolidation, and not just for complete mergers. Even limited airline partnerships like the Northeast Alliance that American Airlines and JetBlue announced back in 2020 was met with a lot of resistance. That partnership was essentially an extended codeshare between JetBlue and American, which also readjusted flight times out of Boston, JFK, LaGuardia and other airports in order to allow passengers to combine flights and routes and also rewards. And it was then shut down and cancelled for good in 2023. But more recently, other attempts by airlines to join forces have actually been met with less resistance. So it's possible that the odyssey of Spirit Airlines and even the difficulties of JetBlue might have now shown regulators that actually the industry still needs some more consolidation after all. This has therefore meant that, for example, Alaska Airlines could complete the acquisition of Hawaiian Airlines in September of 2024, and that date is important because it means that this process was completed under the previous US administration, which is worth pointing out since different administrations can feel very differently around mergers. Still, even more recently, Allegiant bought Sun Country Airlines without any objections from the Department of Justice, and the Department of Transport even worked with those two airlines to help them move the process along faster. In other words, we now have some recent examples of airline mergers going through. So with that in mind, would a merger between United and American actually be possible? Well, no. Not really. I'm sure that wherever you are in the world, you know that United and American Airlines are much bigger than all of the other airlines that I've mentioned so far. But they're not just bigger. Airline sizes are measured in a few different ways, depending on what you want to compare. But in two of those ways, United and American Airlines aren't just the biggest airlines in the United States. They're actually the two biggest airlines in the world. For example, they are the biggest in available seat miles, and they're also the two biggest in terms of aircraft fleet sizes. Put together, they would operate well over 2,000 aircraft, and that's even before we add their regional fleets. In some other metrics, Delta and one or two other airlines enters the top two, but I'm sure you get the point here. If these airlines are already the biggest two in the world, then how on earth could anyone think that it would be a good idea to merge them? If they were combined right now, that new airline would control 40% of airline seats in the United States. So it's not just industry analysts who find this move hard to take seriously. Pilots and other labor unions have some quite harsh thoughts about it as well. And that also goes for various consumer groups as well as regulators and consumer watchdogs in Europe and other parts of the world. And their reasons are pretty simple. Remember those airport slots, for example? Well, many big airports worldwide might object to a single big foreign carrier suddenly handling a large portion of their slots. And that's before we look at other possible issues regarding market share, both within the United States and internationally. So those are some of the downsides. But what about the upsides then? What advantages would there be in merging them? Well, first of all, bear in mind here that the reason that we even know about this discussion is that Scott Kirby brought it up in a meeting with President Trump. Initially, we didn't know if the two airlines had actually discussed this seriously in the first place, and to be very clear here, just before we started recording this video, American Airlines publicly referred to this story for the first time ever and tried to shut it down. They said that they are not interested in such a merger at all and that they have not held any talks with United about such a prospect. Instead, American could deepen their relationship with Alaska Airlines, who they already have code-share agreements with for certain international routes. So, is that then the end of this story? Well, not quite. First, let's look at what Kirby's argument about the merger actually was and why he decided to discuss it with the US president. He reasoned that the enormous airline that would emerge from this merger would be a stronger competitor in key international markets, where currently the US airlines are relatively fragmented. In the past, Kirby has also made a trade deficit argument related to this, which is the kind of argument the current US president seems to really appreciate. Kirby has said that 2/3 of long-haul seats on flights to and from the United States are on foreign airlines, despite the fact that 60% of the passengers on those routes are US citizens. So maybe you see where all of this is going. A combined airline would theoretically have more reach and a better market share in international markets where other airlines now have a much more dominant presence. And also, there's the obvious question of prestige here. And this is where we come back to the matter of premium airlines and what it means to be a flag carrier. Now, me or Ben will probably do a separate video on flag carriers eventually, but the point here is that in many parts of the world, a flag carrier is a single airline that is seen to represent that country both to its own people and to everyone else. So it could be argued that the United States haven't really had a flag carrier, at least since the pre-regulation days when Pan Am essentially carried that role. So on that front, a 2,000 aircraft strong airline, the biggest in the world using any imaginable metric, would certainly qualify as a flag carrier. But like I said earlier, all that assumes that the current international network of those two airlines would then be carried over, as is, to this new combined carrier, which of course wouldn't be possible. And going back to the idea of improving market share worldwide, if this combined airline would have to shed airport slots at key international airports, well then, inevitably, the total US airline market share would go down, which would have the opposite effect to what Kirby was pitching. Even in the domestic market, and even though United and American have organized their networks differently, there would be so much overlap in routes that a reorganization and consolidation would be inevitable. And that would happen even if the regulators wouldn't pressure this new airline to shed routes, which they absolutely would, assuming that they approve the merger at all. Which is doubtful. Now, at this point, some of you are probably just shaking your heads and asking, Peter, what's the point of all of this? Especially if American Airlines has publicly said that this is not going to happen. Well, there might actually be two reasons. Firstly, and I know I'm really speculating here, United could pull off this deal as a takeover, going against United's management if they managed to convince American shareholders that this would be a good idea and would work. Just think about this. If such a merger was somehow approved, who would it actually be good for? Well, a clue there comes from looking at how the markets reacted when this story first broke. And this is actually the first sign that the CEO's revenge argument doesn't make a lot of sense. Because probably the biggest benefactor here would be American Airlines and their shareholders. United's own shares only rose briefly when Bloomberg broke these news, about 1.5%, and then it quickly stabilized again. But by contrast, American's shares quickly rose 7.6% and then remained around 8% up by the end of the day. So, why was that? Well, American are facing some financial pressures right now. Their long-term debt is quite high at $25 billion, and they are also much smaller than United or Delta, or even Southwest in terms of market value. Around $7 billion to United's $31 billion. Now, in theory, the airline's smaller size therefore makes it more vulnerable to crisis. Like, for example, the high fuel prices that a prolonged crisis in the Middle East can cause. And sure enough, American stock has lost almost twice as much in value as United's has since the beginning of this year. And while we are on the topic of the Middle East, Scott Kirby had that discussion with Trump before the war with Iran started. And in some more recent statements, Kirby has suggested that the crisis and the high fuel prices that was brought by it could actually provide United with some purchase opportunities. Now, when he was pushed about that and asked specifically if that could mean buying whole airlines, he said, "We'll see, there's a lot of rumors about that." So here actually comes the second reason why we're talking about this, despite Americans' rejection of the story. You see, we can't really be sure that Kirby meant American Airlines with that statement, because in the months leading up to this, there is another airline that could be the candidate for a United takeover, and that's JetBlue. Officially, United has denied this, but in the months that followed, other statements and actions told a bit of a different story. When asked later, Kirby said that such a merger would be up to JetBlue, without offering more details than that. And even more recently, United and JetBlue has entered a code-share partnership called Blue Sky, which seems to have quite a few similarities with that Northeast Alliance that JetBlue and American Airlines were forced to abandon a few years ago. And all of this begs the question, is it possible that Scott Kirby was just bluffing all along? Because let's be honest here, even at a time when the United States has a government that's very warm towards businesses and corporations' affairs, United and American Airlines joining forces, either amicably or through a hostile takeover, would be practically unthinkable. To put it bluntly, if these two giants would be allowed to join forces, then how would any other corporate merger ever be refused in any industry? But what if Kirby is pitching a merger or takeover of American Airlines, counting on the stories of bad blood between himself and American Airlines, when what he really wants is a merger with JetBlue? Maybe there's a little bit of three-dimensional chess being played here. But the thing is though that even that wouldn't be as straightforward as it might sound, because JetBlue have a lot of the same issues as American, including a sizable amount of debt, which also make them vulnerable to the current Middle East crisis and high fuel costs, as David Neeleman recently explained. Now, Neeleman is the CEO of Breeze Airways and a guy who has launched at least 5 airlines successfully, including JetBlue, so his take on these issues is always worth paying attention to. United are probably eyeing JetBlue's network and their fleet, but the current crisis means that they likely won't want to make a move like that because it will cause them to take on a lot of debt. Obviously, like many other industries right now, aviation is already deeply in crisis mode, so the actions of the likes of United, American and JetBlue will depend heavily on what happens over the next few weeks and months. But what do you think about this? Do you think we will see other mergers soon, either inside or outside of the United States, and in that case, who? Let me know in the comments here below. And also, I hope that you've checked out my new channel, Mentor's Black Box, where my team and I create documentaries about accidents and incidents outside of aviation, but in the same style as Mentor Pilot. Here comes a quick taste. It's the 10th of May 1993. Thousands of workers are moving through their shifts at the Kader toy factory on the outskirts of Bangkok, just like they would on every single day. But this time, things will soon become different in a truly tragic way. What's about to happen will eventually have international ramifications and also highlight just how important proper building planning and fire training really is. The Kader toy factory comprised of several different buildings inside of a large industrial complex located in the Sampran district of the Nakhon Pathom province in Thailand. It was built as part of a wave of similar buildings in the 1980s and 90s in order to fill the demand for relatively cheap labor and high production rates posed by international organizations on Thailand at the time. The factory was therefore built to optimize for efficiency and output rather than for great working conditions and safety. And this in turn meant large floor plates with loads of people filling them, minimal interruptions to workflow, and a smooth transition from raw materials over to the finished products. But the fire security at this site had been questionable from the very beginning. And the reason we know that is because the Kader industrial company, who owned the factory, had actually had its license suspended back in 1989 after another fire had destroyed its original factory on that same site. The facility had then been rebuilt, and the Thai authorities allowed the restarting of production in July of 1990, less than a year after that initial blaze. But even after that, several other, smaller fires had again been reported, of which one had actually led to substantial damages in Building 3, which was still being repaired when this story took place. After that incident, though, Thai labor inspectors had visited the factory and issued stern warnings to the company and had outlined the need for safety officers, more safety equipment and an emergency plan. But work was still allowed to continue, which brings us to the 10th of May 1993. This was, by all accounts, a completely normal day, with workers carrying out their duties in the various parts of the factory. The weather was good, with a relatively strong southerly wind and high temperatures. Now, the building we will concentrate on here is Building 1 of the Kader complex, which was also the largest one and connected to Building 2 and 3 in an E shape. In there, the workers and their stations were distributed over 4 floors, with each level handling a different stage of the production or storage. Now, according to reports, there were 1,146 workers in Building 1 during this afternoon, with 36 on the first floor, 10 on the second, 500 on the third, and 600 on the fourth. This meant that the majority of people were concentrated on the upper floors, which is important to remember. Now, the building itself was constructed using a steel frame, which was then supporting the massive concrete floor slabs. It also had internal stairwells and freight elevators connecting the different levels, just like thousands of other similar buildings from all around the world. So for the workers on the site, it wouldn't have felt unsafe or dangerous in any way. But this is actually going to be a theme in this video. Just because something looks and feels safe, it doesn't mean that it actually is. And to understand why, we have to look at several different theories around industrial design and fire protection. You see, all buildings out there really only have one job in the case of a fire, and that is to buy time for the people inside. But that can be done in many different ways. Now, most people think that time is only needed for people to get out, and while that is true, what's really important to understand here is just how that time is used. And the details matter here, because how things are done will affect how a building needs to be constructed in order to maximize that time. For example, if a fire were to break out, all of the people inside will need time for the following things. Detection, which is actually finding out that there is a fire. Decision making, that's when everyone decides if and how they need to act on the warning that they have received. And after that comes movement, which kind of speaks for itself. You need to actually move to get out of the building. But that comes with its own specific challenges that I will soon get to. But then, most important of all, the building needs to facilitate the survival of the people who are inside for at least as long as it takes for them to get out. Now, on the face of it, all of those things might sound obvious, but if you think about it, each of those points contain quite large potential challenges, who all needs to be handled correctly, one by one, in order for a building to be safe. If only one of those steps actually fails, well then the other ones quickly become useless. I hope you like that. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.